And before this video begins, I would just like to thank my Asbantium level patron, Fowlon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. The spectre of Doctor Who Season 2 looms ever closer, with more and more information now that we know just how close it is to appearing on our screens at the unholy hour of 8 AM on a Saturday. Oh dear. But with the new knowledge and information we've now learned about Season 2, it's reminded me of one of Doctor Who's biggest current problems. A few years ago I made a video about Doctor Who having a monster problem, a real lack of returning monsters and villains, and the absence of a cohesive, connected fictional universe. But in the time since, I think that problem has actually grown much worse in the last few years. When was the last new, original Doctor Who monster that truly made a splash and became a recurring, memorable villain? These monsters and villains are the core of the show, but it's hard to deny that it has been lacking, and for even longer than it initially seems. So as we hurtle towards another series, let's take a look at the issue it seems set to continue. It's time for Doctor Who's Monster Problem, Part 2, I guess, 2025 edition. When you think of Doctor Who, one of the very first things that comes to mind is the rogues gallery of monsters and villains. Daleks, Cybermen, Weeping Angels. The only thing more important than the Doctor's travels in time and space are the foes they encounter. Monsters are crucial to the very identity of Doctor Who. After all, the Daleks were the literal difference between life and death for the show itself. Monstrous enemies proving far more entertaining and threatening than a bunch of cavemen with sticks and rocks. The importance of monsters and villains absolutely cannot be understated. It's part of why we haven't had a so-called pure historical since the 5th Doctor era, since the show is now so reliant on having some kind of alien invasion or mutant mastermind for the Doctor to overcome. There's a common saying related to Doctor Who about hiding behind the sofa, because as a kid you would be too scared to sit on the sofa to watch. You would have to kind of peek out from behind it, like a shield protecting you from the horrifying monsters on screen. If Doctor Who didn't have good, memorable monsters, that saying wouldn't exist. It would be no different to any other show. But the fact that the show built itself on inventive, scary, and sometimes revolutionary enemies really says so much about where the priorities need to lie. But the current problem is, it's not creating those monsters and getting new generations to hide behind the sofa. And that's a dangerous game to be playing. As I mentioned, the very foundation of Doctor Who is the existence of monsters. It quite literally wouldn't have survived without the Daleks. Classic Who therefore is rich with many recognisable monsters, even if sometimes they're just giant ants with human legs. I hate you so much, Web Planet. Why do you exist? I hope you got wiped instead of some of the other stories. The Daleks, Sensorize, and Zarbi were in the admittedly limited pool of First Doctor foes, but then when you got to the Second Doctor onwards, it was an explosion of a lived-in universe full of all these wild monsters and aliens. Suddenly we had Cybermen, Macra, Yeti, Ice Warriors, all menacing the Doctor, and they all had iconic, very memorable designs and premises. The Second Doctor was the man that fought the monsters, and it redefined Doctor Who, cementing this idea of the monsters being just as important as the Doctor himself. When you look back, so many promo images don't just show the Doctor. You have the Third Doctor against different monsters, some of whom he never even had stories with, like the Cybermen and Yeti, but they were iconic enough that they were in the photos. You have the Fourth Doctor with Daleks, the Fifth Doctor with Daleks. If you need to market Doctor Who, you show the Doctor with the Daleks, because those monsters are that iconic and ubiquitous. Classic Who created so many monsters we still talk about and see to this day. Just look at the Silurians and Zygons returning during the 11th Doctor era, or the constant demands and speculation for the Sea Devils return long before their eventual actual return in Legend of the Sea Devils, which, with a title like that, It would have been quite weird if they weren't in that one, to be honest. These reputations, this demand for returns, all stem from a memorable original design and premise. And to its credit, the modern show has been able to do this too. When you look at the early years of modern Doctor Who, it's chock full of iconic monsters. It's part of the whole point of the episode The End of the World, showing off the universe and how colourful and varied it can be. Also, yes, because every time these kinds of topics come up, the term monsters is just general Doctor Who lexicon for aliens. They don't always have to be villains. You can have monsters who are allies. It's literally just how the show defines any alien creatures as monsters, because people always get on me about this and say, oh, but they're not monsters, they're not enemies. And it's like, yes, but when you're talking about these things, you just call them monsters. That doesn't mean they have to be villains. And also, you know, hang on a minute, what does that say about you if you consider monsters to always be a bad thing? You know? Anyway, Series 1 really does make a statement with Cassandra, the Reapers, and the Slitheen. All monsters and enemies people can immediately associate with Doctor Who, despite being brand new. The first Russell T Davies era was exceptional with creating these kinds of new foes. It gave us the Sycorax, it gave us the Ood, Catkind, Clockwork Droids. Hell, even the Absorbaloff is kind of iconic, albeit all for the wrong reasons. All of these are so recognisable and distinct as Doctor Who monsters, and at the pinnacle of them all are the Weeping Angels, who by this point are just as famous as the Daleks. Sometimes I'll even catch YouTubers who hate Doctor Who refer to the Weeping Angels because everyone just understands the term instantly.
Oh, I see. She's a weeping angel.
And that's an incredible monster legacy to have. It is what you want from your villains, for them to enter the public zeitgeist and be so recognisable. And do you know what the other most important thing is? Well, first of all, hitting that like and subscribe button, but also making money. Which I guess is kind of the same thing, isn't it? Cast your mind back to those halcyon days of 2008. You walk into Toys R Us with your parents and make a beeline for the Doctor Who section. And you know it's the Doctor Who section because there's a giant picture of David Tennant. But hang on a minute, look. There are the Daleks and the Cybermen too. And look at all those shelves full of merch. I mean, don't you want to buy the incredible destroyed Cassandra figure? Or faceless Grandma Connolly complete with the Wires TV action figure? So you can recreate iconic scenes from The Idiot's Lantern. Like this one. But as ridiculous as these figures are, they show the importance of creating memorable things on screen that you can turn into merchandise, because it's so recognisable. Hell, even the Hoyks got a figure despite appearing for like 2 minutes in Love and Monsters, and that's probably being generous, it's probably not even that much. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly a fan of consumerism and materialism, but the sheer nature of Doctor Who monsters should lend themselves perfectly to merchandising. Like Power Rangers, for example. A family show or a kids show should have significant appeal to kids and get them to engage with the show even when it's not on their TV screens. And that's why monsters are so key, because they provide that. They give something for the kids to imagine and play with. And sometimes it helps to just have a very marketable monster, like the Adipose, which had their own plushies, and everyone remembers them because of how damn cute they are. Now, obviously the decline of merch and toys isn't because of Doctor Who's on-screen quality. It's actually a wider issue in the industry because kids are now more likely to be spending time on video games or their phones rather than playing with action figures like previous generations did. That's not me being an old like boomer, it's literally just how things have progressed, causing figures and merch to now be more for adult collectors. But it still shows how a successful monster can be more than just an on-screen presence and far surpass the show itself. And of course, the most important part of a Doctor Who monster is their potential to return, because that's the sign of staying power. If it's something that's timeless and a concept that can return time and time again. The Cybermen are mechanical monsters that can be redesigned over and over again, but maintain their core appeal. The Zygons are monstrous shapeshifters that can blend into society and snatch bodies. A monster with a good design and a good backstory can become a cornerstone of the show, no matter how good or bad their episode is. When the Daleks or Cybermen first appeared, Nobody expected them to become such a staple of the show. They were just another one-off monster, but they were received so well that they had to come back. But when was the last time we had that? Return potential is so important, but in the current era of the show, it's hard to imagine what monsters or villains could even return. Let's look at the so-called RTD2 era. The Meep already existed. The Not Things, sure they could come back, but it would take a really clever story. The Toymaker already existed. Okay, what about the goblins then? Sure, you can imagine them making another appearance, but what about Season 1? So few of these villains are suitable for returns or notability. The Bogeyman was a one-off occurrence. Boom literally just had a landmine. 73 Yards had the mysterious lady who was like Ruby the whole time, not exactly something that could return, and so on so forth. Really, the only new traditional Doctor Who monsters from the current era are the Cholders from Rogue. They can't exactly return because there's not really much you can do with them. Again, compare this to the first Davis era, which had inventive and creative original monsters bursting out of the woodwork. So what has gone so very wrong? Where are the new monstrous faces of fear of Doctor Who? As I've mentioned, monsters are so important. Even Dalek Sek's hybrid form was a face of merchandising because he was such an instantly recognizable part of the show. The first Davis era was exceptional at these standout monsters, and it really laid the foundations for the modern show. That's also because of the type of stories they were. Monster of the Week is a dated format these days. I won't deny that, and we'll get to that later. But the key is in the title, Monster. It means, by definition, every episode has to have some kind of inventive threat. But ever since 2010, the show has very much moved away from this. Series 5 was a transitional series. It had a lot of familiarity with the past of the show, but towards the end of the Smith era, there was a change, and the Capaldi era cemented it. Instead of fascinating and intimidating monsters with interesting backstories and cool designs, the threats were more existential or one-off misunderstood monsters. As great as Series 8 and 9 are, almost all of the threats or villains are disposable or freak accidents, if you will. The Teller, whilst a cool design and premise, was a misunderstood entity. The Foretold, a one-off. And it's a problem that gets worse and worse as you go. The Chibnall era was a big offender of this. What memorable monsters are there from this era? Which ones could you imagine being in that Toys R Us lineup? You're gonna have the evil birds from Praxeus? The curtain rags of the Ghost Monument? Or maybe the bubble wrap from Kablam? Ironically, the most iconic Chibnall era monster might actually be something like the Pating, because it has those same adipose vibes of being cute and marketable despite being a Doctor Who monster. We're far removed from the days of the Weeping Angels becoming the lasting legacy of Doctor Who. Blink was almost 20 years ago now, and only The Silence really came close to succeeding them. But even they were only really around for like one story arc. It was up to Big Finish, as usual, to try and get more out of them. Doctor Who is a big brand with a long and significant legacy, so memorable monsters, new and old, can lead to buzz, merch, and a sense of fan engagement. After all, look at how many people were talking about the Meep and demanding a Meep plushie. Doctor Who doesn't need to be a constantly high concept show with really complicated storylines and human or robot villains all the time. If you keep it simple, you can succeed. Sometimes a Doctor Who monster needs to be simple to be effective. The Slitheen? People remember them because they just farted a lot. You don't need a big budget to create the next best thing. It doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel or the most revolutionary thing on TV. As long as there's enough potential, a monster can become iconic and a staple of Doctor Who. And it's annoying when you do get good original monsters that just never get used again for no good reason. I'll always point to the Sycorax in that regard. They have a really interesting aesthetic and backstory, yet they only got one episode and they never returned. In my original video, I talked about the importance of a shared universe where all these aliens and monsters show up regularly and interact, akin to something like Star Trek or Star Wars, which have all sorts of consistent alien races mixed in with the more one-off ones. You can still have your Toclophane or your God Complex Minotaur, but then you have your big hitters like the Daleks, Cybermen, Weeping Angels, etc. And in the middle, you have your new inventive original monsters that can be pushed into being big hitters. You know, it's like your mid-carders in WWE that can always go up the card like Jey Uso did. Or a more appropriate example would be Stardust coming back and becoming the face of the company. You never know. After all, if you're a good Doctor Who showrunner and you want to create the next big thing, only you can do that. So, how do you fix all these issues? How do you make Doctor Who about the monsters again? Well, the obvious answer would be to bring some modern classics back. The Boneless were pretty cool. They could easily be brought back, like they were in comics. The Dream Crabs can always be reused, like Big Finish have done. Why can't the Krillitane come back? After all, it was explained that they constantly evolve and change their forms, so they could constantly come back just in a slightly different form each time. And I think that's something a lot of people don't understand. It's been 20 years since Series 1. Those viewers have all grown up. I mean, just look at me. We're not nostalgic for Sutekh coming back because he was before our time. But what we are nostalgic for are those RTD1 monsters. If the Slitheen came back, it would probably have the same effect as the Autons returning in Series 1. So that's what you need to treat those older New Who monsters as. They can be effective returns that help cement them further into the Doctor Who mythos. And to his credit, Chibnall did try doing that, bringing the Judoon back in Series 12, and it did get a lot of fans excited. Naturally, with this kind of approach, you can risk the dangers of member berries, which nobody wants. But there is power in a kind of nostalgia, because a Doctor Who monster return is usually pretty effective because of how recognisable they are. The other answer is the more general, seemingly obvious answer of just make better monsters. And yeah, I get it, that's like telling a homeless person to just buy a house. But there really hasn't been much of an effort to make and market new monsters to carry the image of the show. Like I previously mentioned, most of the recent stories have been more high concept narratives with one-off monsters or human-esque villains. But if you write a traditional Doctor Who story, create the Ocelotons, which are humanoid aliens with bright orange skin and spider legs, and actually market them, you might have success there. They just haven't actually tried that recently, because we're so divorced from the original idea of traditional Doctor Who that monsters as a concept have faded, and that's our exact problem. Do you like Evolution of the Daleks? Probably not, right? It's not an amazing story, and a lot of fans just outright hate it. But when I said Evolution of the Daleks, what did you immediately think of? That's right, Dalek Sec and his weird human hybrid creature. What a bold move, right? He looked very silly and strange. But you remember him, because they marketed the absolute hell out of him. He was absolutely everywhere when that episode came out, so it worked to make him a memorable monster. But that kind of commitment doesn't exist in a landscape without toys and constant magazines, and of course the brutal immediate savagery of social media, which is so quick to shut down anything that doesn't immediately work. It's obvious that not every monster has to be a Dalek, a perfect adversary that can become iconic and return time and time again. Yet at the same time, not every episode has to be midnight. The show doesn't need to be Black Mirror with a blue box, like it's constantly trying to be nowadays. All those memorable monsters are essential to the legacy and continuation of Doctor Who. Sometimes it helps to meet the Zogbats from Planet Zog every now and then, or make something so simple and effective it's the new Weeping Angels. It can happen. It surely can't be that hard, honestly, you just have to scare enough kids. I've always been vocal about Doctor Who still being kind of stuck in a mid-2000s TV model, but Monster of the Week has been a core part of the show for far longer than that. Sometimes a monster is good, like a Dalek. Sometimes it's not so good, like the Vervoids. But there's a reason you have monsters like the Krynoids returning in expanded media, because they're memorable enough to do so. So it's disappointing that the modern show doesn't make better use of its existing memorable monsters or focus more on creating new ones, because pretty much every monster return is one from Classic Who rather than New Who, and we just can't have every monster being a one-time deal because that just gets so boring and tiring, hence this video. The fanbase is screaming out for something tangible and new to sink their teeth into. The man-traps went down great, but can't exactly return because they were a one-off concept. And this lack of new monsters really subtracts from the soul of the show, because monsters as a concept are so important and such a foundation for Doctor Who to begin with. I just think the legacy suffers when you can't easily describe or write a Doctor Who monster because, the casuals need to understand it. It needs to be a very simple and able to return return whenever, not just be a one and done every single time that the casuals immediately forget about. Because the casuals are responsible for the legacy of the show. That's why Weeping Angels are so big. It's not just about the hardcore fans. But what do you think? Does Doctor Who have a monster problem? Is it better or worse than it once was? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron, Fowlon Cortez, my Platinum level patron, Matthew Burns, and all my Gold level patrons, Ben Salmon, Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, and Seb Falco. Thank you so much for your support.